So I'm delighted to welcome Irish poet, bilingual poet and scholar Paddy Bushe, who has agreed to come on and talk about his poetic work of, I would say, it's not just poetry, but it's also his poetic work of engagement and participation in the landscape and the history, in the geography of his situation and where he lives. This poetic project he has shared with me over the past couple of years, and I've been delighted to see it. Having discovered his poetry originally through his translation of the Song of Amergin, which we've studied together, and through his hosting of the Amergin Festival, which just started in the last couple of years. And incidentally, on a personal note, it turns out that the places and the situation of the events described in the poem, those are actually a place that is already very dear to my heart, being in Ballinskelligs Bay, where I have been spending holidays all my life. And I had the good luck to see him a couple of years ago in his home in Waterville. And well, perhaps, Paddy, could you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Sure, Mark. Well, at the moment I write. I used to be a teacher, second level teacher. I'm originally from Dublin, but we moved here, no family ties or anything, but moved here at the age of 25 in 1973. I had never heard of Amergin or the Lebor Gabhala at the time, and gradually got to know about it. What I would say, you were kind enough to say I was a scholar. I would say rather that I draw on other people's scholarship. I have a great reverence for scholarship, but my engagement with it is imaginative and free. But what I do have in my poetry is I tend to relate a huge amount of what I write to the place in which I am writing it, or about which I am writing, even if that place doesn't make a direct appearance in the poem. And as I look out my window here in beautiful sunshine, I can see a rock. I live just at the edge of the sea. There's a rock about half a kilometre offshore that's called Carrig Eanna, which is the Irish for Eanna's Rock. And that's in fact a version of the name Erann, and in some versions of the Milesian invasion, that rock makes an appearance. And when I came here first, the then principal of the school I was teaching in here in Waterville said, "You know about that rock in a 17th century poem." I had never heard of it, but out of that grew my interest in the Milesian thing and the invasion, and it's allowing the landscape to speak.
Absolutely. And I think that the way that this poetry then becomes a poetry that is very strongly embodied. It's a poetry that it is of a place and in a place. It's situated. It's not just abstract. It's not all in the mind. It's a poetry of the sensory, of the sensual.
Yeah.
You experience the physical, the realness and the texture of the place, and that's in your poetry, I feel. But
yeah,
let's go back for us.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, I like poetry that deals with otherness, with spiritual dimensions, even though I don't have any religious belief in the normal sense, but I like otherness. And to me, you can't have something that's other unless you have this, unless you have the physical
Yes.
and the palpable. that gives you a context for otherness. Otherwise, otherness is completely unrooted and has no relevance to my life.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because it seems like, um, for there to be the other, um, we might even go so far as to say, further to be the other world, there
Yeah,
must be this world.
absolutely.
Otherwise, as you say, it's untethered. It
Mhm.
doesn't it doesn't reflect anything. It isn't bouncing off anything.
Yeah, and there's
But
nothing by
just,
which you define it as other,
well,
unless you have
exactly. Well,
this.
exactly. It doesn't make sense.
You
Um,
can't have
but
abroad unless you have at home.
yeah, that's lovely. That's lovely. Home and away.
Mhm.
Um, just to go back for a second, just to give a little bit of, perhaps let's situate us for those people who are uh, listening or watching, and who aren't familiar with the geography of Ireland, for example. So you grew up in Dublin, and Dublin is, as is the main city, about a third of the population there. But the place you moved to is kind of at the opposite end of the island, southwest, um, facing out into the Atlantic. There's a series of peninsulas, one of which you're in the middle one, which is the Iveragh Peninsula,
Mhm.
and these these are, as you mentioned in your text, today they are kind of marketed as part of the Wild Atlantic Way, which has
Mhm.
been a massive success. But anyone who's traveled the west coast of Ireland knows that it is rugged and, uh, not exactly isolated, but it has a kind of a wildness to it, doesn't it? I mean, the Wild Atlantic Way is fair.
It
Um,
does, yeah. The Wild Atlantic Way is, one of the better pieces of marketing. Um,
yeah.
yeah, a wildness, a ruggedness on the west coast, very much like the west coast of Scotland, which shares
Mm,
a similar culture, a similar Gaelic culture, and that landscape, that wildness, that maritime aspect is very much integrated into uh, Gaelic literature historically.
absolutely. And as you say, like the west coast of Scotland, the west coast of Ireland, these are the places where the kind of the Gaelic culture and the oral culture and the folk culture has has remained and been conserved to the greatest degree. And so West Kerry, which is what we're talking about, um, West Kerry is one of the places in Ireland where there are Gaeltacht regions, where there's still official Irish speaking regions. Um, I myself went to Irish college in the village of Ballinskelligs, Dungagan, um, when I was 15, and did, this is what Irish people do instead of summer camp. They go and speak Irish
The rite of
all day,
passage.
every day, and it's a rite of passage. And every evening you have to do a Kaylee, and if you're very lucky, you might, you know, meet people of the opposite sex for the first time in your life. But that's for the city kids anyway, who get sent off to do that. So you're living in this quite isolated area compared to Dublin, and you came there to be a teacher. And what prompted the move? Was it just that there happened to be a position, and you said to yourself, right, this could be a chance?
No, it's although I grew up in Dublin, imaginatively I grew up on the West Coast,
Mm,
particularly in Kerry, because my father's work involved, I won't bother going into it, but involved a lot of travel, particularly in
right.
summer months. He might, be working in various places for a couple of months. So when other kids, unless they were very affluent. I mean, foreign travel was unusual. If other kids
Mm,
might have a week's holiday in Bray or Tramore or some resort like that on the East Coast, very often we had 2 months holidays in Kerry or Galway or Donegal,
mm,
mainly Kerry, where we rented a house, which was, very easy to do at the time. Tourism hadn't been
mm,
that much developed. So I just, love the West and the mountains and the sea and the coast. And luckily, Fiona, my wife, felt the same way. And, we just, I applied for jobs up and down the West Coast. Um,
Mm,
and this was the one that came up that particularly appealed. And we've been here ever since, and since 1973 on a house just at the edge of the Atlantic.
mm,
It has it's an area that's very challenged demographically, a very much
right.
diminishing population. Rural depopulation is a problem everywhere. Rural depopulation in tourist areas can be even worse, um, because tourism is seasonal. Um,
Hmm.
in other words, it doesn't have a year-round economic driver. So unless you have your own business, it's not a year-round employer. So it's a place that's facing big challenges. You see lots of houses, but an awful lot of them are holiday houses. Um,
Yeah.
much as you have more in central Brittany, for example, that I've seen. But
Yeah, absolutely. It's thanks. Sorry. Um,
okay.
the I think that we're my own family, in a sense, are participating in that phenomenon, because for years we would rent a house in the village, which is literally just across the bay from where you live, and then our we have one of our great family friends has had a house there because she grew up in Carsavine, and they had a little house just down there, and they would go there every summer, all summer, and
Mhm.
we would join them sometimes. And then eventually my parents ended up buying a house that was in a new development of houses that were specifically built to be holiday homes.
Mhm.
And of course, most of them are only occupied, a couple of months a year maximum, and there's the one that they bought, the owner, the person who had had it built, had never seen it, had never set foot in it, you know,
Yeah,
because it was an
yeah,
investment. It wasn't a property they built for themselves. It was a property they built to rent and to make money on. And of course, then the economic downturn happened, and they didn't
yeah.
make the
But
money.
yeah, but on the other hand, tourism is an economic lifeline for places where you had marginal farming that's no longer economic, and it's
Right.
too far away, and roads aren't good enough for industrial development. So, tourism doesn't cause the problem of
Sure.
depopulation by itself. Now, if it sends up prices of property so that people can't buy or rent property on a lower income, that's can be part of the problem. But tourism is, and for the foreseeable future will be, a very necessary part of the economic life of the west coast of Ireland, particularly, because it doesn't have other things to depend on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you were saying that it was only when you arrived there and took up your job in your 20s, it was only then that you heard about the landing of the Milesians, and the whole story of the invasions, the settlements of the Lebor Gabhala Erann. Now, for myself, it's slightly different, because I had been reading those stories since I was a little kid. Um, I had my parents had a copy of the Jim Fitzpatrick book, the Book
Mm,
of Conquests, that tells about. I think it actually kind of summarizes the whole thing, but in a beautifully illustrated
mm,
version. And I've been reading that since I was a little kid, and so this has been part of my mind's landscape. And then I'd been going to Ballinskelligs for the last 30 years, but it's only in the last couple of years that, I mean, and through your work, that I realized, oh, this is the same place. This is where they're
yeah,
supposed to have
yeah.
landed. And
Yeah,
I
well,
was
I did.
absolutely stunned.
Yeah, I did have, a general idea of that sort of thing, but I knew about, I learned in primary school who Clan Avila were, but it was all very vague and all mixed. Tuatha
Mm,
and Miletians, they were all the same to me, and I certainly
mm,
didn't associate them with any place. but it's when I look out and see a rock, and then on Skellig Michael read that one of the Miletians is buried there, and I see a lake behind the village of Waterville that's named in the Lebor Gabhala, then it becomes real. Then the story is grounded. And, you know, we were talking before about you need to have the here before you can have the away, or the this before the other. You know, the speculative, the imaginative needs a ground, it needs a place. And
Absolutely. And I think this is fascinating to me because so often when we think about mythology, and when I talked to my students about mythology, we talked about the fact that mythology seems to happen in that kind of other space where it's kind of outside time, like it's maybe long, long ago or long, long in the future, but it's in a sort of a time without time, but often in a kind of a space without space too. We don't know exactly where. And I know that in other famous mythologies, like sort of, let's say in British mythology, like Arthurian, there's debate about, no, this is the place where King Arthur was. No, this is the place where he was. And there's all these theories. I know in Greece it's a bit more specific, like they very much name, like it's this mountain and
I
this
would
cave
imagine,
and
yeah, I mean, I don't know Arthurian mythology particularly well, but I
mm,
imagine whoever told the story originally knew where they were talking about. And if they said, you know, we
yes.
crossed the river or came from somebody, they had a place in mind that maybe hasn't
Mm,
survived, and somebody who did the retelling had a place in mind. But, you know,
mm.
whoever composes the story first, whether it's orally or written, I would imagine knows where they mean.
And so this is fascinating to me because then when I read your work and I saw, for example, the Holger Lunsa monument, that the Amergin monument that is in Waterville now, so I had this shock because I realized this isn't something that is beyond our reach. This is a place we can walk in, and it's a place we can look at. And from that, I suppose I'd just like you to tell us, perhaps, it all started with a rock in the bay. And you pointed out this rock, or your headmaster pointed out this rock. What was the story of the rock?
Well, the story of the rock is that in the Lebor Gabhala, there was one of Amergin's brother called Erann. And during the Tuatha Danann wanted to stop the Miletians landing, they created a fog which confused them, and Erann climbed up the mast to spy out, could he see Ireland. The boat hit off a rock and Erann fell off and drowned. Now, in the Lebor Gabhala, it doesn't specify a particular rock, but in a 17th century poem called Tirv na Herdin, which was written locally here by a man called Sean O'Connell, which was mainly about the Cromwellian invasion, but he went back over the mythology. He said, "Atá bun chorán fós gan trécha an charig ler caile go seachalach éana." Near the river Quran, there is still to be found the rock where through error Aena was drowned. Okay, so he identified this rock that I'm looking out the window now to see, and after
Yeah,
which we named our own son. You know, we called our son Aena. Um,
Anna, yeah.
and we called him that before I knew the story of the rock at all.
Oh God.
Yeah,
Oh, brilliant, brilliant.
it was just
It's
because of
it's
the,
amazing. Yeah,
yeah,
how these
I do remember my, you know, he was born in 1976, and my mother, when I said Anna, she said, oh, where did that name come from? And I said, it's the rock out there. And she looked at me and she said, I heard of children being called after saints. I heard of children being called after relations. I never heard of children being called after a rock.
that is excellent. And of course, like since then, the name Anna has become much more popular. Like there's,
Yeah.
I have more than one friend who has a son called Anna.
Yeah, it has.
It's a beautiful name.
It has become quite common around here. It was always common in Galway because there was
Sure.
a Navéana to do,
Mm.
the ferry to the Aran Islands years ago was called the Navéana.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I think I remember that.
Mm.
Now, this is incredible because you write about this in your work. Do you think that when these poets, like when Sean O'Connell is telling the story in the 17th century, is he claiming it and localizing it? Or do you think he's drawing on a tradition that this was the rock where Éanna foundered that goes back much further? Or is it just
Um,
that his voice was a strong one?
it could have been because there's no other record of Anna being mentioned with that rock that I'm aware of. Or, God
Mm,
knows what has been lost. But
of course.
he may well have been drawing on something because during the 19th century, there was a traveler called Lady Chatterton who moved around the area. She went to Valencia, she went out to
Mm,
Derrynane to meet the O'Connells, and she was told the story of Éanna and the Rock. And John O'Donovan, when he was surveying for the Ordnance Survey, mentions it. So I don't know whether that specific tradition originated with the poem. I suspect, as I said, that Éanna was a kind of a garbled version, a corrupted version, if you like, textually of the name Erann. I doubt if Sean
mm,
O'Connell made it up because other things he
mm,
mentioned are, he mentions Down, for example, being buried on the Bull Rock of Beara Peninsula, and that
yeah,
exists in other versions. So it was certainly a local version, but I mean, all of these myths have variations. They were to a large extent transmitted orally. And we know
mm,
ourselves, through exercises like Chinese whispers and rumors and, all sorts of things that can happen on social media. The apparent facts of something can change immeasurably over 10 years. So, how much will they change over centuries when most people were not literate and there wasn't a written record? The
absolutely.
amount of
And I
all
think that,
variations.
and what's really interesting as well is that, you know, part of it is not just the deformation of the story, but part of it is that when, I think particularly when it's an oral tradition, when somebody's telling the story live, there's so much more immediacy when you say, there's this thing that happened to a friend of my brother's, you
Mm.
know, and the story could be repeated all over the country, but it was always a friend of your brother's, like at one remove. Like you always claim vicinity, you claim a sort of a
Yeah.
you're just out of reach of the story. And so for him, whether or not the tradition goes back hundreds more years, which it could well, um, he's telling the story, and of course he's going to tell the story and set it right next to him and say,
Yeah.
if you look over there, you'll see the rock where Éanna fell.
Yeah.
Is much more impactful than to say there's a rock off Galway, and I
Yeah.
hear.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so that's really fascinating, and from that we extrapolate, or I mean, you actually have other textual and landscape-based evidence that the events of the landing of the Milesians are localized to
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Ballinskelligs Bay.
Yeah, I mean the oldest written version of it that we have is from the 11th century, and the one name that there can be no doubt about is the name Loch Leoch, which was the older name for Loch Carron in Waterville, and that is specified in the text as being beside where they landed. Now that's only about half a kilometer from the sea, and they said the Leabhar Gabhala specifies that they landed there. So John O'Connell may have been uh, making something up or getting a local version of Carrigéana, but other aspects of it, the Skellig and Loch Leoch or Loch Carron are specifically mentioned in the text. But of course, when we say that, general historical opinion, scholarly opinion, the normal term for the Lebor Gabhala is pseudo-history. In other words, it wasn't factual anyway. So it's quite possible that whoever first wrote the Lebor Gabhala took various legends and decided, well, this is the area I know, I'll place it here.
Right,
And
absolutely.
invested a story into his own landscape or her own landscape. We don't know. Probably his, given the times.
Mm.
So, I think the factual truth of legend, it's a rabbit hole. There may be some basis, but the details of it, you just have to take, like Arthurian legend, like different versions of Greek and Roman things. You know, what's the fact of it? The factual situation.
Mm.
But
And I suppose that,
they have been, the human imagination has invested stories in a particular landscape. So those
right,
stories now exist in the landscape, whatever the factual truth or lack of it that gave rise to the stories. They're there now.
absolutely. And I think that what we discover when we start thinking about, does it matter if we can prove archaeologically or otherwise that such and such is true? It's kind of a moot point, because the story itself, its function, as far as it seems to me, when we're dealing with mythology or pseudo history, which I guess is a kind of a history that is shaped to fit what we need rather than what we know. Um, when you do that, the factual basis or the evidence basis is kind of a moot point. And as you say, when the story is told, it is now told in such a way that it is imbricated with this landscape and invested in this landscape.
Yeah,
And the landscape animates the story as the story animates the landscape.
yeah, and two different. I mean, the archaeological truth of something, the factual truth of something, the mythological, legendary truth of something. They can all coexist. They
Of
all
course.
they have their different realities. I mean, the Milesians, the general date, if there was any such travel, they came from Galicia in northern Spain, roughly 500 years BC.
Mm,
Now, and they came apparently after Ireland was seen from Brogan's Tower, which is near A Coruña in Galicia in northern
mm,
Spain. There was a tower there built by the Romans as a lighthouse, but it wasn't built till the 2nd century AD. So it couldn't
mm.
possibly have been, you know, there in Milesian times, even if you could see Ireland from there. But what it was somebody, Spanish people, seeing a lighthouse there and maybe knowing some story about Galicians going north from there, and they decided, oh, that's a good place to place this story. But
Right.
it's now part of that, the reality of that tower, even though in purely factual terms, it's chronologically and physically impossible.
Absolutely. And in the same way as, to climb to the top of a tower in Galicia and to see Ireland is, I think, physically impossible,
Mhm.
but symbolically it's possible,
Absolutely.
that they were aware of Ireland, because we absolutely know now that they were, and that there was trade up and down the western seaboard
Yes.
of Europe, that early. Absolutely there was.
Yeah.
And we can see in the kind of the continuity of cultures and traditions, even along the western seaboard, the Celtic fringe, as they say, um, from Galicia to Brittany to Cornwall to Wales to Ireland to Scotland, that there was movement back and forth, and there was trade in goods, but also in language and culture, and surely in people. And so symbolically, the idea of climbing the tower and spotting this kind of promised land, this promised island, I mean, it has a powerful symbolic truth, it seems to me.
It does, and myth and symbol are very, very powerful forces. You know, one of the things when the whole Brexit debate was going on in Britain, I believe one of the reasons the Leave side won was because the Remain side took a very rational, factual point of view and talked about the economic cost and all the rest. The Leave side took a historically inaccurate, very mythologically powerful thing about England always being independent of Europe and greater than it and being threatened by it, and worked on that. And that's what won the referendum, I think. You know,
I think you're
the
absolutely right.
Michael
I think you're
Gove,
absolutely right. And
Boris Johnson argument, I think the Remain side, rather than concentrate on the kind of mythological force of a wonderful united Europe, which would put an end to war forever, or which was the foundation myth of Europe, they ignored that and said we can't afford to leave it. And of course, mythological, heroic Britain automatically said, of course can afford to leave it and we'll stand on our own 2 feet. And that created its own myth.
absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right that, so often what we realize about political ideas, or, I mean, it could be, even corporate slogans or corporate identities, anything, that the better story is the one that wins.
Yeah.
It's not the people with the better facts. It's not the people who have the better evidence. And I think, Britain, you're absolutely right with that example. I think we see exactly the same thing in the United States these days, is that, whatever you want to say about Trump and his supporters, no matter how crazy some of it seemed, they were telling a compelling story.
Yeah.
They were telling a story that got the hearts and the guts, and the Democrats were trying to speak to minds.
The rugged individual with a gun against a government that wants to control them. Very strong myth.
Absolutely. I mean, the founding myth of America, really, isn't it? Absolutely. And for that, let's come back around for a second now and say, speaking of that, you've got this moment in our founding myth. This is our the Lebor Gabhala Erann it's the foundation story, let's say, of Ireland. Maybe not. Does it reflect exactly the waves of actual settlement? I mean, I know that it's T.F. O'Reilly, isn't it, who says he had the theory that the Lebor Gabhala Erann corresponded specifically to, the arrival of the Bronze Age Beaker people and the arrival of the first wave of Belgic Celts and then the second wave of Belgic Celts. And he thought that it mapped exactly onto the actual waves of settlement. Now, I think that's pretty much been debunked. But at the same time, as you said, these things get distorted over time. And I think there's no doubt that it's the remains of a kind of a popular memory, a folk memory of different populations arriving. I mean, it's absolutely clear that happened.
Yeah, so, and different populations to make, not to put a tooth in it, a wonderful Gaelic race. And it was made particularly strong in the 17th centuries by people like Sharon Caton and Sean O'Connell, whom I mentioned. And there was a strong religious aspect to it as well, because they were struggling against the new English Protestant invaders, whereas the Catholic Anglo-Normans, they had been integrated and they were fine.
Right.
A different myth later made it 800 years of oppression since 1169. Jeffrey Keating or Sharon Caton wouldn't have recognized that, because he had it that it only began with Queen Elizabeth was the centuries of oppression. You get different stories, and I think
that's fascinating, because I think that what you're putting your finger on there is that, pseudo history, if you like, for the invasions of the prehistoric peoples, so to speak, the pre-written records peoples. But in fact, you can trace the same pattern up well into historical times, because, the arrival and settlement of the Vikings, while initially violent, of course, they came to live then, and they came to intermarry, and they came to, have internecine conflicts and alliances with Irish clans. There were some, people of completely mixed heritage that we would refer to as Norse Gaels. But so you've got the Norsemen at that point, and then the Normans, who share some heritage with them, of course. They do come perhaps initially for conquest and material gain. But what happened to them, just as happens in the Lebor Gabhala Erann, is that they might come with a sword in hand, but they end up bargaining, and they end up settling, and they end up having relationships and marrying, and they assimilate. Yeah. And it's only, as you say, it's only really later with the Elizabethan plantations that we start to see true colonial movement, rather than just movement of populations. I mean, I know that there was conflicts.
Well, there was conquest with the Normans, and fairly brutally, but I mean, so was there between Gaelic kings before them, and indeed between monasteries before them. I mean, a lot of the most brutal massacres were monastic.
I didn't know that. Is that true? So the monasteries would go to war with each other, would they?
They did indeed, because they made their alliances with local kings, and they were part of a power structure, the same way as European colonialism in South America, for example, was a church and state together thing.
Absolutely. And I think that's really interesting, because yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, and I've seen a lot of debate online in certain circles talking about how Christianity came along and wiped out the Gaelic pagan culture and so on. But then, people who have a bit more of a nuanced view say, well, actually it didn't. I mean, it took a long time for it to even become predominant, and it integrated a hell of a lot of the Gaelic pagan society. Not only, it integrated a lot of their kind of worldview and cosmology to an extent in the Celtic Christianity that was created, and the saints were spoken of. The hagiographies very much set them up as not an antidote to the Druids, but rather as competitors. Like, they were doing the same thing. They were good at magic, and they were good at thaumaturgy, and also as what you're saying now, and that really kind of chimes with that, is that the social structures and the kings of the small minor tua, the squabbling and constant raiding and wars between the little kingdoms, that the monasteries didn't come and make away with it. They came and they integrated into that way of working.
Yeah.
And the Brehon laws similarly were conserved, and the poetic traditions were conserved.
Even there's an example of that, the 9th century poem, the Cailleach Beara, that usually anglicized, not very well, but as the Hag of Bear. The oldest manuscript copy of that, from I think the 9th century, says that the Cailleach Beara, who was an earth goddess figure, sort of became a nun, but that she was allowed to continue to operate with the permission of Saint Finan, who is the patron saint of the Ivra Peninsula. So here you have, in a Christian manuscript, presumably written in a Christian monastery, you have somebody saying that a pagan, not so much pagan, pre-Christian earth goddess was allowed to function in the Christian period with the permission of the patron saint. So you have it integrated into the manuscript. We will use parts of the pre-Christian tradition to enhance our status as the new religion.
Absolutely. So in fact, there's this kind of there's really a syncretism. It's not so much one culture and one worldview and one religion being wiped out. I mean, I even heard someone throwing around the term, cultural genocide in relation to the arrival of Christianity in Ireland, and tried to explain to them that absolutely not. It's another element that got added to the mix. And like the populations, it got integrated and perhaps it became dominant as let's say, the Celtic sort of Goidelic speaking population became culturally dominant, but they didn't erase what was there before. They assimilated into it and they adopted it and they adjusted it and adapted it. Like in the same way that we can say that the beliefs and practices of the Gaelic Irish were also informed by the people who 3,000 years earlier were building the stone alignments and Newgrange and so on. They might not have been the same people, but their landscape and their mind's landscape had been built and informed by those previous inhabitants.
Yeah. And, I discovered here in two monastic sites. You may be familiar with the monastic site up at Kilrealik,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Out towards Bowlis Head, and another site on Church Island in the lake here that are Christian sites. And a few years ago at midwinter, there are passages going in, made into those cells, passages at ground level that had never been explained. And I had a bit of a hunch about them, and I went and checked them at midwinter. And what they were built for was to allow midwinter sun to penetrate into the cell, the Christian cell. In one case, a cell about the year 1000 AD. Now, the midwinter sun, as we know from Newgrange, was very much part of pre-Christian Irish belief. I grew up, when I was at school, I was taught that the older pagan Irish were sun worshippers, and St. Patrick and Christianity put an end to all that.
Right.
Here you have monastic sites built 500 years after the arrival of Christianity, have integrated that midwinter sun into the very architecture of the Christian monastery. And if you think about it, that's what Christmas is. There's nothing in the Bible that said Christ was born on the 25th of December. That didn't become part of official Christian belief until about the year 400. And it was obviously to say this is a midwinter feast.
Absolutely. And I think that you make the very good point in your chapter. You make the very good point that it's very simplistic to call it sun worship. I mean, that sounds like a sort of it sounds like something that we would say of a very primitive people who were in awe of this golden burning disk in the sky, but not at all. I mean, they were tracking the movements of the sun and tracking the movements of the stars and planets with an accuracy that is stunning to us today. And there are feats of architecture and engineering where they were building these alignments of passage tombs or stone circles to where they were corresponding to equinoxes or solstices and so on, is frankly still kind of baffling to us that they had the skill.
Yeah, but even I don't think that they were just tracking them and had the skill, that they were giving them a spiritual, imaginative dimension apart from their interest in them from a scientific or natural phenomenon point of view.
I absolutely agree. I mean, like certainly I don't mean that the engineering feat was a goal in itself, but rather, as you say, that therefore it was integrating into their lives and their beliefs and their worldview these kind of natural cycles and these movements of the heavens, which one has to assume they were associating with the movement of the human soul and the movement of a human life and so on, by marking those with ritual like when we look at those landscapes, when we look at like Newgrange or the Ettercua alignment, we must imagine, and you write very movingly about this, we must imagine the assembly of people, you know, at midwinter, who are waiting for the moment when they see, you know, and we must imagine that having a profound spiritual significance.
Yeah, yeah. As it still does, you know. I mean, Easter is an equinox feast. You know, when whatever Council of Trent was it, decided
Yeah.
on finally on the date for Easter. It was the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox.
Yeah.
Christmas is very obviously a midwinter feast. St. John's Eve, that used to be celebrated all over Europe with bonfires and still is in many places, was a midsummer feast. So, you know, all of feasts that we think are Christianity traditionally, or I grew up with, as being some kind of divinely ordained thing, are in fact just marking periods of the year.
And I think that when you have that sort of realization and the insight that this, you know, what they would call in kind of modern pagan traditions, they would call that the wheel of the year, and they would talk about marking the solstices and equinoxes and the cross quarter days from Irish tradition. And when you start being aware of how the progress of the year through the different hours of daylight and through the different cycles of the moon, when you start thinking in those terms, I think that your relationship to the passing of time really changes. You start to feel more at home in the cycle of the year. You know, more at home more at home in the stream of time, I want to say.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I, you know, I think that's important, and I think it's part of our relationship with the world that, you know, maybe we're forgetting. Even the way we talk about weather in Ireland. I mean, I remember noticing when I came here, when, you know, farming was still very important, and there'd be a sort of muggy, grey day in April, and that my urban self at the time, you know, wasn't particularly keen on. But my neighbour is, you know, dead long since, an old man said to me, "It's a lovely day. It's good growthy weather," because that was right.
Growthy. Oh yeah.
It was right for that time of the year. If it
Mm,
was a similar day on a different day of the year, but we've got used to, you know, fine weather means when you go to the beach and there's a bright blue sky,
mm,
and that therefore if you have holidays or something, it must be that sort of thing. And it's I think it's not a very healthy way to live. You know, I'm not saying you shouldn't go somewhere to enjoy different conditions, but that you're
mm.
conditioned to think rain is bad, blue skies are good. That's a level of alienation from what gives us life that
Absolutely, and particularly
we need to
if
be
one comes
aware of.
from if one comes from, you know, maritime northwestern Europe, it's an absolute ticket for depression, because if you feel like rain is a bad thing, well, you know, 250 days of the year you're going to be pretty depressed. But if you have that sense that, you know, the rain is life-giving and growth-making and nurturing, that I think that as you say, like there's a connection and a kind of a healthiness, like a sort of a puts you in right alignment with the landscape. And
Yeah,
as a city dweller, I think that our relationship to the urban landscape is very alienated and very detached. Like we don't, when we're in the city and it rains, well, you know, you get in under shelter, like or you open up your umbrella. Um, I had an amazing experience about 2 years ago, where I went to the writers' retreat in Anamkara in Iries in the
I
Beara
know.
Peninsula. I
With
think
Sue.
you're with Sue, and you're well known in the house. They had all your books, and Sue, that's actually the first place that I was reading more of your poetry, because Sue was telling me about your work, and at one stage, I went for a walk to find my way to the end of the little river that runs past the house at Anamcara. And I wanted to find where it comes out into the bay. And so I walked along the road, and then I cut across a field, and I found my way. And then as I was coming back, it started raining. And this had not happened to me in years, but I had to walk for half an hour in the pouring rain, and I had no umbrella, and I had nowhere to shelter. But if you live in a city, you're never far from a place where you can just duck in out of the rain. And so it was strange to me that suddenly I had this experience where, no, it's raining, and you're just going to live with that, and you're going to walk in it, and you're going to, and actually I enjoyed it. I thought, God, this is brilliant. I'm absolutely soaked to the skin. This hasn't happened to me in years, because I'm too protected. I have places to go, and I have things to shield me from the weather. I haven't got properly sopping wet to my bones in a long time. And it was quite a salutary experience, I must say.
Yep.
Now, I wonder if we could just, I don't want to keep you for too long, but the thing I'd really love to do now, perhaps, is can we talk specifically about the most famous Amergin poem, the one that Robert Graves calls it the Song of Amergin, and it's you quote this line, and it's one that I think many of us would be aware of, but the idea that one's poetic education, and I think, in the quote, he says English poetic education, which is interesting, should start not with the Canterbury Tales, not even the Odyssey, not even Genesis, but rather with Amergin. And I find that a fascinating idea, but also fascinating that when I reread the quote, that he says English poetic education.
Yeah, well, like Graves had very mixed feelings about Ireland. Like he had strong Irish roots and spent a lot of his youth near Sneem. He was,
Right.
which isn't, just 20 miles away from here. But at least as shown in The White Goddess, he was completely unaware of the local connections of the Amergin story. But he also said that his father had cut the connection in his autobiography, Goodbye to All That. The quotation, something like, his father had cut the connection, for which he was very grateful. So I think
Yeah.
I think he really meant English language, and maybe European would have been more accurate.
Yeah, and I think that possibly when he says English there, he's speaking about a literature in which is included Scotland, Wales, Ireland as Anglophone literatures, even though they're all hyphenated in a sense, except for the actual English, but Anglo-Welsh and Anglo-Scottish and Anglo-Irish, or whatever you want to call them. But I find that fascinating. And when I was teaching this course, that's kind of what we did. We kind of said, well, look, this is the origin story. This is the place where it all springs from. And if we look at it like that, if we look at the insular imaginary springing from Amergin's song, what does that mean about this imaginary and about this imaginal world? And I think that the implications are stunning. Now, to begin with, you were telling me, and you've written about this, that Graves calls it the Song of Amergin, and his translation is a version that is, he switches around order of the lines, and he doesn't translate every line, and he adds some of his own stuff. And his version is absolutely beautiful, but it's not accurate as such to the original.
No, it's interpretive, and interpretive in a personal way. Now, everybody does that, and all translations do it. To my mind, I think Graves goes a bit far, and he embellishes the poem, I think, in a way that it doesn't need to be. I tend, I tend to think of the poem as being, because I grew up in a nationalist, Catholic nationalist tradition, and again, a lot of the European imagination uh, deals with ideas of conquest and ownership and
Mm,
invasion and that sort of thing. But if you think with now, this is also, it's slightly tendentious, but what happens with Amergin, to a very important phrase before the poem itself is setting his right foot on the land,
mm,
Amergin said, I am. It could be anywhere. And he doesn't say, I own this place, or my people own this place, or I'm putting a flag. Now I know that's
mm,
part of the narrative, but in the words of this thing, he says, I am this place. And a corollary of I am this place is this place is me. So I tend to think of it as a statement of identification with the place, not ownership of, exploitation of, even othering of. It's the exact
mm,
opposite to the kind of exploitative commodification that says this is a place from which I can make money, which
mm,
uh, really an awful lot of what modern economic thing does. If you do exploitative um, exploitation, whether it's to do with oil or very intensive farming or cutting down forests to make cattle, to make beef burgers, if you say you put your right foot on it, you establish a connection with it, and a very symbolic right foot.
yeah,
And you say, this is me. What flows from that, I think, is that I will not wound this place because I would be wounding myself. And
absolutely.
he was speaking uh, on behalf of his people. I mean, Amergin was their judge, he was their lawmaker, he was their poet, he was their leader, and he was a benign leader, as other aspects
Mm,
that are too complicated to go into. And he he made arrangements, with the Tuatha Dé Danann, and tried to avoid conflict. Down, who was buried on Bull Island, who went there, the Bull Rock, I should say, uh,
yeah,
was a more sinister, warlike type of figure who wanted to put them all to the sword and wanted
yeah.
to. Amergin was much more, we must integrate with the people and we'll allow them keep names. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is, the hippie version of child of the 60s, but there is an aspect of it that's very tolerant of different languages, different races, different places. There's even one telling in Forrest Fassa, Shahrun Keaton in the 17th century. His version of it says that they left Spain because of drought and famine, or famine after 26 years of drought. So you could think
Mm.
of the Miletians in one telling of it as being economic migrants, which is
or
another
or even climate migrants,
climate,
that
climate
they're
change might.
and I think that what really strikes me about what you're saying, and about in my own reading as well of it, um, when he claims this identity, or inhabits this identity with the poem, he's kind of making a statement about the place of not just his people, but of humanity in the world as
Absolutely.
a fundamental part of the ecosystem.
Yes.
We're not outside it, and we don't dominate it or master it or exploit it. We are it. Like, we are this. this is us, just as you say. And I think um, there's the fundamental kind of disconnect between that discourse, the discourse where we claim identity with the elements and elemental forces, with the landscape, with the, and not only that, but he also, in the poem, he talks about those things as being part of nature, but also about poetry and knowledge as being all part of the
Yeah.
same thing.
Yes.
Like it's not just a kind of a hippie like back to the earth thing. It's that no, all of human experience is also part of this ecosystem,
Yes.
and there's a seems to me to be a big disjuncture between that and the sort of the early Anglo-Saxon writings, where humanity is much more kind of adrift in a hostile nature rather than embracing its place in welcoming nature. And I wonder if that's just to do with climate. Like if you read something like the fragments of the Seafarer, or if you read Beowulf, you've got you've got these humans who are heroically striving to
Mm.
survive against the
Yes.
harsh elements and against the monstrous creatures of the night. Um, and whereas Amergin is saying, look at this plenitude and look at this abundance and look at this fullness, and I am of it.
And
Um,
as was it, the person who saw Ireland first from Brogan's Tower
mm,
and went, and who was killed by the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland, one of the reasons they fell out with him is that he said to them, there is plenty here for everybody, and it's a mild
mm,
climate, and there's enough food. Why are you fighting among yourselves? And
mm,
they didn't like this, and they killed him. Now, there, I don't think we can impose too much on what's there, but it's
no,
reasonable to say that this is an element in it, you know, from which there is a useful myth to be identified.
absolutely. And I think that what you're saying there is really important, that it's not that the exercise would be not to somehow claim that, oh, yes, you know, 2000 years ago, the Irish Gaelic tradition was creating this kind of very
Yeah,
ecologically aware, environmentally friendly. No, but it's that we can read it into it. We can
yeah,
say, this is there and it can serve us, because that's a myth that's really useful right now.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the sort of thing that people sometimes do, with Native Americans or with
Mm,
Native Australians, to say that they were, climatology or ecologists millennia ago,
mm.
it's a bit soft-centered, really. I think, you take elements of something and say, this
Mm,
is part of the myth, and that this is the part that's a good thing for us to read today. And I think another thing we need to keep on reminding ourselves is that texts like this were written long before nation states. I mean, the growth of
absolutely, yeah.
the nation state over the last few hundred years has changed. We talk about French people think of this, or Spanish people think of
Mm,
that. You know, Amergin or his people wouldn't have recognized that kind of easy division between people, um, uh, you
for
know,
sure.
and large units of society like that. Um, so, do you want me to read this, or?
Well, I'd love that. I'd love that. And just before you start, you've told me that the title that you use for it has
Mhm.
changed over time, because originally, you know, it doesn't have a title in the original text. It's just his speech, right? And Graves calls it the Song of Amergin, and it's best known, I guess,
Yeah,
referred to as that title. But you've changed over the years in your
yeah,
appellation for the
yeah.
piece.
And again, it's not that there's an accurate title, as you say. There's none. I first of all called it the claim when I translated it first, and my versions of it changed too, because the text, there are arguments about the literal meaning of it.
Mm,
Um, I first of all called it the claim because it was that idea of possession, invasion, and all partly because of its, the traditional telling and the culture in which I grew up, that foregrounded that. Then, when I started thinking of it ecologically, I thought of it as manifesto. This could be seen
Mm,
as an ecological manifesto. I am the wind, am the sea, and so
mm,
forth. Then I got rid of the I out of it and just made it am as being a universal thing. Now, the title I have in this book is The Amergin Step, because
mm,
in the Lebor Gabhala, putting his right foot on the land, and the symbolism of that kind of embedded itself into me. But I also think of it as, if we make that reading of it, where you can see the ecological, climate migrant, various elements in it, that is also for us a mental step, a psychological step, an aesthetic step into, a different form of consciousness is too big, but a changed consciousness, another aspect of things. So I think of it literally as a step into another way of thinking.
I think that's wonderful. And I think I love that idea. And as you imply, it goes to things like the tradition of first footing, like the first person to set their foot over a threshold. And it also, to me, speaks of that idea of having one foot in this world and one foot in
Yeah.
another world. He's got one foot on the boat.
Mhm.
So one of his feet is on the nature of his people as migrants, and his other foot is about to get planted. His other foot is about to set itself on its land, and be
Yeah.
on the land.
Yeah.
But I think that what you're talking about now, and I think it almost mirrors, you know a step that we as a society need to take, and in microcosm, perhaps the step that you've taken to go from claim to manifesto to step, just one step at a time, but a step into a different space.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. And I would love to hear you read it. And it would could can you read the Old Irish first?
I wouldn't, my old Irish wouldn't be good enough, but I have a version in modern Irish, which is very close
Oh,
to the,
that'd be wonderful.
um,
That'd be wonderful. Because you just to remind people, you write a lot of your poems in Irish, and
Mhm.
then you translate them yourself. So
Yeah,
you're a practitioner of self-translation,
yeah.
which is a whole fascinating topic. But so we're going to hear then
Yeah.
the Amergin Step. How do you say it in Irish? What's the title in Irish?
Came Amergin. Okay.
Cush came Amergin.
Yeah.
And
Which
in
is
modern Irish and then in English.
literally uh, footstep. And just to explain that, like in the English version, rather than say I am the wind on the sea, they say I'm wind on sea. And I've just very quickly to bear with me. I've three reasons for doing that. Number one, in
Please.
medieval Irish, it's gaith imwer. Okay, and so I like to be able to say am. I suppose the main reason I do it is that although it's am in and see, I think it's a collective statement. So
Mm,
by saying am, it's taking the individual, even though it's still first person. And the third reason, and it's a bit of an indulgence, it reminds me of the Oriental as being a
mm.
sacred syllable, a sacred breath. Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Pushkin Abergin. Agus a chos yes á legan an dalmhaige dúirt Abergin. Mé gé muir, mé town dílan, mé glór mara, mé damh seach górach, mé fiollar eil, mé deor drochta faoin réin, mé áilecht fáis, mé tarc gail, mé bradán sa lín, mé loch bhá, mé si aigena, mé gath bua lí sa cha, me dia ein and tinnis sa chiaun. Cé yn reig chahan schlé, cé chahan scolas chochan yn y gali, cé o grian cael lihig yn grian, cé rhorian tawnt a réaltacha mar van amara, cé a hailsi yn y tawnt a réaltacha sin, céin drawn, céin dia, a chur yn ffair lana yn nŵn ailse, cuine na nga. Queen na Gaisha. The Amergin. Setting his right foot on the land, Amergin said, I'm wind on sea, I'm waves swelling, I'm ocean's voice, I'm stag of seven clashes, I'm falcon on cliff, I'm sunlit dewdrop, I'm rare of bird, I'm boar in rave, I'm salmon in pool, I'm lake in plain, I'm learning's essence, I'm sharpened spear dealing death, I'm God who kindles fire in the head, who makes smooth the stony mountain, who elucidates the lives of the moon, who proclaims where the sun will rest, who leads starlit waves like cattle from the ocean, on whom do those starlit waves smile? What troop, what god edges blades in a plague-struck fortress, keening of weapons, keening of wind.
Thank you so much.
I get great that every so often, every few days, I'll think about it, that in the story, pseudo history, whatever you call it, but my imagination now, Amergin steps ashore just below my house and says that. So it's an incredibly vibrant myth for me.
I think that it's you know, I have known the Graves version for quite a long time, and it was only, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago that I went looking for better translations, and I found yours. And since then, those words and the music of those words and the music of the Old Irish, which I cannot pronounce myself either. Like I could pronounce the modern Irish no problem, but the Old Irish, I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced, or Middle Irish, I should say. And I try, I do. I mean, I say the words out loud to myself because there is such magic in them, and I say your version of the poem, and I feel like you know, it's one of those things that if you create this as a part of your personal mythology or your national mythology or whatever you want to call it, your cultural mythology, and you say to yourself, this is one of the well springs of my identity and my my people. It's incredibly powerful because those words acquire such resonance, and then to hear them spoken by you in the conjunction of those 1,000-year-old words and your modern Irish, and then your English, and then you're looking out your window at the place it happened. There's something absolutely awe-inspiring about that, and I think it's for me there's a magical moment, and also not only that, but the fact that I'm having this conversation with you, and I'm sitting in my living room in Paris, and you're sitting in your living room in Waterville. There's a great sense of strange alignments between worlds that are worlds away, you know. So I just, you know, thank you for that. That was really a magical moment for me.
Just for the Old Irish translation, there's a film version of it, a lovely film made by a man called Donal Céalachair, and the original version is voiced behind it in various voices, one of which is mine, and
I've seen it. Yeah.
yeah, that pronunciation, it was checked with John Carey, Professor John Carey in
Yes.
UC, who is the premier academic authority on the
Right.
whole
And
hour.
we found I found that that film version, and I shared it with my class, and I mean everyone was very swept away by it, because I mean the imagery in it, and the sort of the different overlapping voices speaking in that sort of, I mean, 1,000-year-old pronunciation. Um, it's very stirring. It's very stirring, and I think that for those of us who were raised speaking Irish, to hear medieval Irish, or to see it written and try to articulate it, it's a bit like those of us who have learned Romance languages but never learned Latin. It looks achingly familiar, and it
Mm,
sounds achingly familiar, and we feel like, oh, I do not know those roots, but I sure know the branches and the shoots.
mm,
Um, the old Irish um, has a very particular kind of resonance to someone like me who spent his childhood in Ireland, and for whom Irish words and Irish speech uh, were part of everyday life.
mm.
Um, but I think that there's also something very there's a kind of a nostalgia in the way that, like, almost a pang, like a pain of loss, because when I hear you speaking Irish, or when I hear other people who are fluent speakers, and who can write in Irish and who can move between the languages very easily, um, I do feel that loss for myself, that I'm not bilingual. I'm certainly not. Like, I was very good at Irish in school, but I haven't spoken it in 20 years.
Mm.
And so um, it makes me feel like a phantom limb, that
Yeah,
there's a
well,
whole language.
yeah, I mean, it's a loss that you could extend to the whole country. There were, okay, I write in Irish, but the amount of people who can function easily in Irish in now is quite limited, and it is.
Yeah.
It's, I don't think it's any loss, cultural loss for the country that everybody speaks English, but it is a
No, no.
loss that very few people speak Irish. As it is in French terms, the loss of Breton is a big cultural loss in that area, because you know landscapes have a language and place names and myths and so forth that are important.
They are. And I think that perhaps that's a good note to end on. I think that this idea that, um, you know, national languages, and, now English becoming such an international language, they're a good sense in that kind of lingua franca sense, because they give us a way of communicating with each other. But as you say, um, you know, language is rooted in landscape. And I've been reading that wonderful book, 32 Words for Field, about all these words in Irish that exist for concepts that English cannot come close to expressing, because they just don't exist in English. There's no word for that thing. That idea does not exist. And every language has those. Every language has things that are so particular and specific. Um, and that, as you say, like, every language is rooted in place, and it's rooted in the land, and in the weather, and in the, you know, it's like the old cliche about Eskimos having 50 words for snow, which apparently isn't true at all. But
No,
certainly the Irish have.
yeah, well,
Sorry.
I'm not sure I completely agree. I mean, I know some of the examples in 32 Words for Feel, and there are things like that.
Mm,
But frankly, I think those things are not so much linguistically determined as it's the way of life people have. I mean, if you have
mm,
engagement with snow or with different types of fields and land in a micro
mm.
all the time, you'll have a language for them. I mean, Robert Macfarlane has a book called Landmarks, and in
Yeah, I know it.
in Gaelic, in all sorts of things, there are words that have disappeared from English because most of the people speaking it don't engage with them anymore. You know, landowners who go round their land, who have much bigger farms than before, have quad bikes and, don't walk animals over it anymore. They lose place names. It's
Yeah,
not just the language, it's a way of life and a way of engaging with the place. That's
absolutely. And I,
language is very true. It's a way into it. And in Ireland, language is hugely important for ecological stuff in general. But
yeah,
it's engagement with place, I think, is the primary driver of things like that.
I think you're right, and I think you express it better than I was trying to get to it at. But it's a lovely place to leave it, with your words echoing in our ears, and your engagement with the place that you have so beautifully rendered for us in your poetry. And I hope to see I hope your book is going to come out. Is it going to be published as a book? Your work
I
on all of
I
these
hope
things.
so. I'm just finishing it up. I haven't done anything about, I've only ever published poetry before, so I looking. And
Well, I
thank
think that
you. I really enjoyed our talk and our exchange of
oh
ideas. Very valuable.
well, it was, and for me, it's just wonderful to have this talk with you. And I think that when you say that your book, which is about all of this, um, is different, and that you've only published poetry before, and I think it's exactly what you say, that the language is poetry, but what you describe in the book is the poetic way of being.
Yeah,
It's the
well,
poetic way of life.
that's what I've tried to do. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Paddy Bushe, really appreciate it, and we should do this again sometime.
Déanamh muid é sin agus go raibh míle maithagad.
Go raibh míle mágat, tú féin.